Sister Wives Courtroom Shocker. The verdict that changed everything. Let's start the part 3 and final part. The courtroom felt heavier than it ever had before, as though every truth revealed, every accusation spoken, and every tear shed throughout the trial had settled into the walls themselves, pressing down on everyone inside. And when the therapist was called to the stand, a quiet ripple moved through the gallery. Because this was no longer just a battle of words between former spouses. This was the voice of professional truth stepping into the storm, and she stood there composed, her demeanor calm and grounded, yet her presence carried undeniable weight as she began to speak in a steady, measured tone about her sessions with the Brown children. Describing weeks and months of conversations filled not with confusion or imagination, but with consistent patterns of fear, anxiety, and emotional distress, recounting how the children spoke about walking on eggshells, about being afraid of their father's temper, about the looming threat of being taken away from their mothers. And as she spoke, the courtroom remained utterly silent, every word landing like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every person present. Christine wiping away tears that refused to stop, Janelle sitting upright yet visibly shaken, and even Meri's hardened composure beginning to crack, because when a trained professional confirms what had once been dismissed as emotion, the entire narrative begins to shift. Yet Kody's attorney rose quickly, attempting to dismantle her credibility, pressing her with sharp, calculated questions suggesting bias, suggesting influence, suggesting that the children's words could have been shaped by the mothers they lived with. But the therapist did not waver, her response calm yet firm, explaining that trauma of such consistency does not originate from suggestion. That fear expressed repeatedly and independently carries its own truth. And that children, especially at such vulnerable ages, do not fabricate fear with such clarity. And that statement alone seemed to echo louder than anything else said that day, because it struck at the very core of the defense's argument, leaving behind a silence that even the scratching of reporters' pens could not break. But then Kody rose again, unable to remain silent, driven not by strategy but by emotion, his voice booming across the courtroom as he attempted to reclaim control of a narrative that was slipping rapidly through his fingers, declaring loudly that these were his children, that he had provided for them, raised them, sacrificed for them, and that everything being said was nothing more than manipulation by bitter women seeking revenge, his words growing louder, more erratic, his arms gesturing wildly as he accused everyone in the room of conspiring against him, his voice cracking under the weight of anger and desperation. And though he may have intended to appear strong, what the courtroom witnessed instead was a man unraveling, a man losing the very control he claimed to have always maintained, while Robyn sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded softly for him to stop, her voice barely audible beneath his outburst, until finally the judge's gavel came crashing down with authority, cutting through the chaos and forcing silence, a stern warning issued that any further disruption would not be tolerated. And though Kody sat back down, the damage had already been done, because in that moment, the image of a composed father fighting for his family had been replaced by something far more troubling. As the session continued, the tension only deepened when the judge announced that a decision would soon be made regarding whether the children themselves would testify, a possibility that sent visible shock through the courtroom. Christine clutching Janelle's hand as fear overtook her expression, Meri's eyes burning with intensity, and even Kody's brief smirk returning as though he believed this development might somehow turn the tide back in his favor. But that illusion did not last long. Because when the judge delivered his ruling the following day, the atmosphere shifted once again, declaring that the children would not be forced to testify in person due to the emotional toll it would impose, but that their voices would still be heard through recorded and documented testimony collected by the therapist, a decision that balanced protection with truth. And as relief washed over the mothers, the courtroom braced itself for what came next. Because sometimes words spoken in absence carry even more weight than those delivered in person. And then the recordings began, the soft, trembling voice of a child filling the courtroom, describing fear in simple yet devastating terms, speaking of yelling, of feeling unsafe, of being told they belong to their father, of wanting nothing more than to feel protected, and as each voice followed, younger, older, each carrying its own tone yet echoing the same fear, the emotional impact became unbearable, Christine breaking down completely, Janelle struggling to maintain composure, Meri's tears falling silently as she refused to look away, and even members of the gallery visibly shaken, because there is a kind of truth that cannot be argued against, and it was unfolding in its purest form, while Kody sat motionless. His earlier defiance replaced with something closer to shock, as though for the first time he was hearing the reality he had long denied, and when the final voice pleaded simply to be free, the silence that followed was heavier than any argument that had come before. Yet even then, the defense made one last attempt, presenting financial records in a dramatic turn, suggesting that the property sales at the center of the case had not been acts of deceit, but necessary decisions made to protect the family from financial collapse, a claim that sent confusion rippling through the courtroom. Introducing doubt where certainty had begun to settle, Christine immediately rejecting the claim with emotion, Janelle urging calm and verification, and Meri's resolve sharpening as she recognized this as a final strategic move, because in every battle there comes a moment where truth and doubt collide, and for a brief moment, the outcome seemed uncertain once again. But that uncertainty would not last, because as the final day arrived, the courtroom atmosphere carried a sense of finality that could not be ignored, the judge entering with deliberate calm, the gavel striking with a sound that seemed to echo beyond the walls. And as closing arguments were delivered, both sides presenting their final narratives, one rooted in betrayal and harm, the other in legality and justification, it became clear that the decision would not hinge on a single piece of evidence, but on the totality of everything that had been revealed, every testimony, every document, every voice that had spoken, and when the judge finally began to deliver the verdict, the room seemed to stop breathing entirely. The ruling came in two parts, first addressing the property, confirming that the sales had indeed been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the wives who had contributed to those assets, declaring those actions deceitful and ordering equitable restitution, a decision that immediately broke through the tension as Christine sobbed openly, Janelle gripping her hand tightly, and Meri allowing herself a rare moment of visible relief. But before that relief could settle, the judge continued, turning to the matter that had come to define the case entirely, custody, and as he spoke of the children's testimonies, the therapist's findings, and the clear evidence of emotional distress, his words carried a gravity that silenced the room once more, declaring that Kody was not suitable for primary custody, that the well-being of the children required a different arrangement, and that custody would be granted to the mothers with any visitation strictly supervised, a decision that landed like thunder, sending waves of reaction through the courtroom, relief, grief, shock, and finality all colliding at once. Kody's reaction was immediate and explosive, rising to his feet, his voice filled with anger and disbelief as he protested the decision, claiming injustice, betrayal, insisting that his children were being taken from him. But the authority of the court remained unshaken, the judge's gavel bringing his outburst to a halt, and in that moment, what remained was not the image of a man wronged, but of a man who had lost control entirely. While across the room the wives clung to one another, not in celebration but in release, because what they had fought for was never victory, it was protection, it was safety, it was a future for their children that did not carry fear. And just when it seemed the moment could not grow any heavier, one final revelation emerged, as a second letter, another child's voice, surfaced unexpectedly, its words raw and painful, describing nights of fear, whispered promises between siblings, and a desperate plea for safety, a final confirmation that what had been revealed throughout the trial was not isolated, but deeply rooted, and as the judge reaffirmed the ruling with finality, the gavel striking one last time, the case was closed. but its impact would linger far beyond the courtroom walls. As the families began to leave, the noise of reporters and cameras waiting outside grew louder, ready to carry the story to the world. But inside, the reality was far more personal, Christine whispering through tears that they were finally free, Janelle holding her steady, Meri placing a quiet, supportive hand on their shoulders, while Kody stood frozen, the weight of everything lost settling in around him, and Robyn beside him, broken and silent, caught in the aftermath of choices that could never be undone. And as the doors closed behind them, one truth remained undeniable. This was never just a case about property or even about betrayal. It was about the voices that refused to stay silent, the truths that demanded to be heard, and the moment when justice finally answered them. The courtroom stood suspended in a silence so heavy it felt almost physical, pressing down on every soul within it. The final words of the judge still echoed in the air like distant thunder, reverberating through the stunned crowd. Christine clung tightly to Janelle, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs, years of fear and uncertainty finally breaking free in a flood of emotion. Janelle, though trembling herself, held her firmly, her face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and fierce determination. Meri stood beside them, her usual composure shattered, tears streaming silently down her face as she placed a steadying hand on both women. Across the aisle, Kody remained frozen in place, as if the verdict had turned him to stone. His face, once filled with defiance and rage, now flickered with disbelief, his jaw tightening as though refusing to accept the reality unfolding before him. Robyn sat beside him, utterly broken, her shoulders shaking as she cried openly, no longer able to maintain the fragile balance she had tried so desperately to hold throughout the trial. The judge's final ruling had not just ended a legal battle, it had dismantled an entire illusion. The declaration that Kody would have no unsupervised contact with the children landed like a final, irrevocable blow. The power he had clung to so tightly, the control he had wielded for so long, had slipped through his fingers in the most public and devastating way possible. Around the courtroom, reporters scrambled to capture every second, their cameras flashing relentlessly, their voices already crafting headlines that would echo far beyond these walls. Yet for the women at the center of it all, none of that mattered. This was not about public perception anymore. It was about survival. It was about the children waiting beyond those doors, children whose voices had finally been heard after so long. As the courtroom slowly began to stir back to life, the weight of what had just occurred settled deeper into every corner of the room. The second letter, discovered by chance as Robyn's purse spilled its contents, had sealed everything. Its words, raw and unfiltered, had stripped away any lingering doubt. Those desperate pleas for safety, the quiet confessions of fear, the shared pain hidden behind closed doors, it had all come pouring out in a way no argument or defense could undo. Even those who had once questioned the wives' claims now sat in stunned silence, confronted with a truth too powerful to ignore. The judge's final declaration had not just been a ruling, it had been a reckoning. Kody finally moved, but it was not with the authority he once commanded. His steps were unsteady, his expression fractured, his voice caught somewhere between anger and desperation. He looked toward the women, toward the judge, toward anyone who might still validate him, but there was nothing left to grasp. The courtroom had seen everything. The carefully constructed image, the confidence, the control, it had all crumbled under the weight of truth. His lawyer attempted to speak, to regain some semblance of composure, but even those efforts felt hollow now, lost in the aftermath of a decision that could not be undone. For the first time, Kody stood not as the center of power, but as a man facing the consequences of it. Meanwhile, Christine slowly lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with something new, something stronger than grief. Relief. Not just for herself, but for her children. For the nights they had cried, the fears they had carried in silence, the voices they had been too afraid to use until now. She whispered softly, almost as if afraid the moment might vanish if spoken too loudly, "We're free." The words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. Janelle squeezed her hand tighter, nodding through her own tears, while Meri closed her eyes briefly, as if finally allowing herself to breathe after holding it in for far too long. Robyn remained seated, her world collapsing in a different way. The truth she had carried, the loyalty she had clung to, the fear that had kept her silent, it had all led to this moment. And now there was no turning back. She had been both a witness and a participant, torn between love, fear, and morality. As she looked toward Kody, there was no anger in her eyes, only sorrow. Because deep down, she understood what this meant. Not just the loss of the case, but the loss of everything they had once tried to hold together. Outside, the chaos was immediate and overwhelming. The courthouse steps erupted into a frenzy of reporters, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting over one another in a desperate attempt to capture the aftermath. Questions flew like bullets, about custody, about the children, about what came next, but the wives moved through it all with a quiet determination. They did not stop. They did not answer. Because for them, the story was no longer about the courtroom. It was about what came after. And what came after was waiting just beyond the noise. The children. The very reason this battle had been fought. As the doors of the courthouse opened and the women stepped out into the gray, storm-heavy sky, there was a shift, a subtle but powerful change in the air. The storm had not passed, but something within it had broken. The fear that once dominated their lives had been confronted, challenged, and ultimately exposed. And in its place, something stronger had begun to take root. Behind them, the echoes of the trial still lingered, a reminder of everything that had been endured to reach this moment. The betrayal, the secrets, the pain, it had all led here. But ahead of them, there was something else. Not certainty, not perfection, but possibility. The chance to rebuild, to protect, to heal. Inside the courtroom, now nearly empty, the finality of the judge's ruling settled into silence. The gavel's last strike still seemed to echo faintly, a symbol of an ending that was also a beginning. Because while this chapter had closed, its impact would ripple far beyond these walls. In the end, it was never just about property. It was never just about betrayal. It was about truth, raw, painful, undeniable truth, and the courage it took to bring it into the light. And as the Brown family walked away from the courtroom, forever changed, one thing remained clear above all else. Truth had been spoken. Justice had been delivered. And for the first time in a long time, the future was no longer controlled by fear. Thanks for watching this video. Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And the next episode coming very soon.